The dust hadn't settled yet when the first truck rolled to a stop outside the wire. Inside, 23 Japanese soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, faces streaked with grime and dried blood, hands bound behind their backs. They hadn't spoken in hours. There was nothing left to say. Each man carried the same silent certainty: they were about to die. This was what they'd been taught. From the moment they'd entered Imperial service, the message had been drilled into them with the precision of a bayonet thrust: surrender was worse than death. The Americans were barbarians. Torturers. They would strip you naked, drag you through the dirt, and make your final hours an exhibition of agony. Better to die with a grenade clutched to your chest than to give yourself over to that fate. So when the truck doors swung open and the prisoners stumbled into the blinding California sun, they braced themselves. Some closed their eyes. Others kept them locked forward, refusing to give their captors the satisfaction of seeing fear. But something was wrong. The guards weren't shouting. No one was being dragged away. Instead, there was laughter, distant, relaxed, almost out of place. One of the prisoners, a 19-year-old infantryman named Hiroshi Tanaka, would later recall the sound as the most confusing thing he'd ever heard. Laughter. In a place like this. Then he saw it. Beyond the gate, past the rows of barracks and the chain-link fences, a group of American soldiers stood in a loose circle, tossing something back and forth. A ball. White leather, red stitching. One of them wore a glove, a strange, oversized mitt that looked almost comical. Another wound up and through, and the ball smacked into the glove with a sound like a heartbeat. Hiroshi stared. Around him, other prisoners stared too. The fear didn't vanish, it was still there, coiled tight in every chest, but now it shared space with something else. Confusion. Disbelief. A flicker of something that might have been hope, though none of them dared name it yet. This wasn't the hell they'd been promised. And in the days to come, that realization would crack open everything they thought they knew about their enemy, about themselves, and about what it meant to survive a war that had taught them only how to die. To understand the shock those prisoners felt, you have to go back. Not to the battlefield, but to the schoolroom. To the recruiting station. To the shrine where young men were told they carried the soul of the nation on their shoulders. Imperial Japan's propaganda machine didn't just inform, it indoctrinated. From childhood, Japanese citizens were immersed in a worldview that painted the West, and particularly America, as a moral abyss. Textbooks depicted Americans as greedy, racially inferior, obsessed with material wealth and devoid of honor. Newsreels showed footage, often staged or manipulated, of Allied atrocities. Radio broadcasts warned mothers that if Japan lost, their daughters would be violated, their sons enslaved. For soldiers, the messaging became even more explicit. Training manuals issued by the Imperial Army included entire sections on what to expect if captured. The language was clinical, deliberate, and designed to terrify. Prisoners of war, it said, would be subjected to interrogation techniques that involved starvation, mutilation, and psychological torture. Some manuals suggested Americans would use prisoners for medical experiments. Others hinted at cannibalism. These weren't fringe beliefs. They were official doctrine, backed by the full weight of the state. And they were reinforced by a cultural code that left no room for ambiguity. The Bushido tradition, as weaponized by imperial leadership, held that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. To be captured was to cease being Japanese. You became less than human. A ghost. Unworthy of burial, unworthy of memory. Officers drove the point home with brutal clarity. Before battles, commanders would remind their men that the emperor himself was watching. That their family's honor depended on their willingness to fight to the last breath. And if the battle turned, if capture seemed imminent, there was always a way out. A grenade. A bullet. Anything but the shame of living as a prisoner. This psychological architecture wasn't just propaganda, it was a survival mechanism for the regime. Japan's military leadership knew that soldiers who feared surrender more than death would fight harder, retreat slower, and accept suicide missions without question. It turned every battlefield into a slaughterhouse, every defensive position into a tomb. But it also meant that when Japanese soldiers did fall into American hands wounded, starving, or simply too exhausted to pull the trigger on themselves, they arrived expecting the worst. They had no frame of reference for mercy. The idea that their captors might treat them with decency wasn't just unlikely. It was impossible. So when Hiroshi Tanaka and the others stepped off that truck and saw guards tossing a baseball, their minds couldn't reconcile it. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical. This had to be a trick. A prelude to something worse. Because everything they'd been taught, everything they'd believed, demanded that it be so. What they didn't know yet was that America had made a choice, a calculated, controversial, and ultimately transformative choice, to fight this war differently. At least when it came to the men it held behind the wire. The path to that California camp began in places with names that still echo like distant thunder: Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Islands most Americans had never heard of before the war, now soaked in blood and memory. Picture the scene: a coral ridge on Peleliu, September 1944. The sun is a hammer, the air thick with the stench of death and sulfur. Japanese defenders have been dug in for weeks, buried in caves and tunnels, firing from positions the Marines can't see until it's too late. The fighting is hand-to-hand, desperate, and exhausting. Men on both sides are running on fumes, no sleep, little water, their nerves scraped raw by the constant crack of rifle fire and the scream of artillery. In a collapsed bunker, a Japanese corporal named Kenji Yamamoto lies pinned under a beam, his leg shattered, bleeding into the dust. He's been there for 6 hours. His rifle is out of reach. His canteen is empty. He can hear American voices getting closer, and he knows what comes next. He fumbles for the grenade on his belt, but his fingers won't grip it. Too weak. Too much blood lost. The voices stop. Boots crunch on gravel. A shadow falls across him. Kenji closes his eyes. This is it. The torture. The humiliation. Everything he's been warned about. Instead, hands, gentle, surprisingly careful, begin lifting the beam. He opens his eyes. An American Marine, face blackened with dirt, is shouting something over his shoulder. Another soldier appears with a medical kit. They cut away Kenji's pant leg, expose the wound, and start working. One of them offers a canteen. Water. Real water. Kenji stares at the canteen like it's a weapon. He doesn't understand. This isn't how it's supposed to happen. Across the Pacific, scenes like this played out hundreds of times. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to believe capture meant death, found themselves instead bandaged, hydrated, and evacuated to field hospitals. Navy corpsmen treated enemy wounded with the same urgency they gave their own. Interrogators, many of them Japanese-American Nisei soldiers who spoke the language, approached prisoners not with violence but with cigarettes and patience. The shock was universal. A soldier captured on Tarawa would later describe the moment American medics stopped his bleeding as the first time I understood I was still alive. Another, taken prisoner on Luzon, said the kindness felt like a hallucination, something his mind had conjured to ease the transition into death. But it wasn't a hallucination. It was policy. The United States had committed, at the highest levels, to treating prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Conventions even though Japan had refused to sign them. Even though Japanese forces had committed atrocities against American prisoners. Even though every instinct in the heat of battle screamed for revenge. This wasn't mercy for mercy's sake. It was strategy, morality, and pragmatism wrapped together. And it began the moment a prisoner's boots hit American soil, or in many cases, long before that, in the dirt and smoke of the battlefield itself. The camp at McCoy, Wisconsin, wasn't designed to look welcoming. Barbed wire ringed the perimeter. Guard towers loomed at each corner, rifles always visible. The message was clear: you are a prisoner. You are not free. But inside those fences, something unexpected was taking shape. The barracks were clean. Not pristine, but scrubbed, maintained, functional. Each prisoner received a cot, a blanket, and access to latrines that actually worked. Meals arrived 3 times a day: rice, vegetables, sometimes meat. The portions weren't generous, but they were regular. No one was starving. No one was being denied water or medical care. For men like Hiroshi Tanaka, who'd spent the last weeks of his freedom eating grass and boiled leather, this was incomprehensible. He'd expected chains, beatings, starvation rations designed to break him. Instead, he got a routine. Wake-up call at dawn. Roll call. Work details, mostly maintenance, camp upkeep, nothing brutal. Then free time. Hours of it. Time to sit, to think, to realize he was still breathing. The guards were another puzzle. They carried weapons, yes, but they didn't use them to terrorize. Some were stern, professional, distant. Others were almost friendly. One guard, a farm kid from Iowa named Eddie Larson, would walk the perimeter and nod at prisoners. Just a nod. No words. But the gesture carried weight. It said, "I see you. You're human. This isn't personal." Medical checkups came weekly. American doctors, real doctors, not interrogators, examined prisoners for disease, malnutrition, injuries. They administered vaccines. Treated infections. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Akira Sato, later wrote about the surreal experience of being handed a pair of eyeglasses by a U.S. Army optometrist. He hadn't been able to see clearly in 2 years. Now he could read again. The absurdity of it haunted him. My enemy gave me back my sight. Still, trust came slowly. The barbed wire was a constant reminder that this wasn't freedom. And the prisoners carried their indoctrination like a second skin. Every act of kindness was scrutinized for hidden motives. Was this a trick? A way to extract information? Were they being fattened up for some darker purpose? Some prisoners resisted entirely. They refused to cooperate, maintained rigid silence, and clung to the belief that honor demanded defiance. Camp administrators learned to separate the hardliners from those beginning to soften, to prevent intimidation and violence within the wire. But for others, the cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. They'd been told Americans were monsters. They'd seen evidence to the contrary. The gap between belief and reality was widening, and into that gap, doubt began to creep. Then came the day the guards rolled a cart into the yard. On it, bats, balls, gloves, and bases. The prisoners gathered at a distance, watching, waiting for the punchline. Surely this was some kind of test. Some elaborate humiliation. It wasn't. It was an invitation. And it was about to change everything. Behind the seemingly simple act of humane treatment lay a complex web of motivations, some noble, some pragmatic, all converging on a single conclusion: treating prisoners well served America's interests. Start with the law. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 had established international standards for POW treatment: adequate food, shelter, medical care, protection from violence and public humiliation. Though Japan hadn't ratified the agreements, the United States had. American leadership, particularly within the War Department, believed adherence to these standards was non-negotiable. It was a matter of moral authority. If America claimed to be fighting for freedom and human dignity, it couldn't betray those principles the moment it became inconvenient. But morality alone doesn't win wars. There were harder, colder reasons as well. Intelligence was paramount. A prisoner treated with brutality will tell you what you want to hear, or nothing at all. A prisoner treated with decency might actually talk. The U.S. Military Intelligence Service, staffed heavily by Nisei soldiers, understood this intuitively. They approached interrogations not as confrontations but as conversations. They offered tea, cigarettes, and respect. And slowly, prisoners began to open up, not because they were broken, but because they'd been surprised into reconsidering who the enemy really was. Then there was psychological warfare. Every Japanese soldier who survived American captivity and lived to tell about it became a living refutation of imperial propaganda. Some prisoners were even allowed to write letters home, heavily censored, of course, but carrying a message the Japanese government couldn't suppress entirely: the Americans aren't what we were told. Word spread, slowly, through underground networks, whispered conversations, and the occasional leaflet dropped over Japanese lines. The impact was difficult to measure, but intelligence officers believed it contributed to an increase in surrenders as the war dragged on. There was also a domestic dimension. American newspapers and radio broadcasts regularly covered POW camps. Photos of well-fed, healthy prisoners reinforced the narrative that America was the moral superior in this conflict. It was good for morale. Good for propaganda. Good for reassuring a war-weary public that their sons were fighting a just war, conducted justly. And finally, there was reciprocity, or at least the hope of it. American leaders knew thousands of U.S. servicemen were being held in Japanese camps under horrific conditions. The official stance was that by treating Japanese prisoners well, the U.S. might encourage Japan to improve its treatment of Allied POWs. This hope was largely in vain. Japanese camps remained nightmares of starvation, disease, and brutality, but the principle held. America would not descend to that level. So when those baseball gloves arrived at the camp, they weren't just sporting equipment. They were instruments of policy. Tools in a larger strategy. But to the prisoners, they were something else entirely. They were proof that the world wasn't as simple as they'd been told. The first game was chaos. Beautiful, awkward, hesitant chaos. The guards set up the diamond in a cleared section of the yard, scratching bases into the dirt and marking a pitcher's mound with a pile of stones. Then they stepped back and waited. For a long time, the prisoners just stared. Hiroshi Tanaka stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, watching. He'd heard of baseball, Americans loved it, he knew that much, but he'd never seen it played. Never held a bat. Never worn a glove. One of the guards, Eddie Larson, picked up a ball and tossed it gently toward the prisoners. It landed in the dirt at their feet. No one moved. Eddie walked over, picked it up, and tried again. This time, a young prisoner, barely 18, reached out and caught it. The contact felt electric. The kid looked at the ball in his hands like it might explode. Eddie grinned. He gestured toward the glove lying on the ground. The kid picked it up, slipped his hand inside, fumbled with the laces. Another prisoner laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound that seemed to surprise even him. Someone else stepped forward. Then another. Within minutes, a dozen men were passing the ball around, testing its weight, its flight, the satisfying smack it made when it hit leather. The guards taught them the basics. Pitching. Catching. Batting. The rules were explained through gestures and broken English, a kind of physical language that transcended the barriers of war. Swing here. Run there. 3 strikes, you're out. It took hours, but gradually, the rhythm of the game began to emerge. The first real game happened a week later. Prisoners versus guards. It was lopsided, clumsy, full of errors and confusion. But it was also loud. Prisoners shouted to each other in Japanese. Guards hollered encouragement. When a prisoner named Takeshi Ito hit a line drive into the outfield and sprinted to first base, both sides erupted in noise. He stood on the base, panting, grinning, and for a moment, just a moment, the war dissolved. Baseball became a daily ritual. Teams formed. Rivalries developed. Prisoners practiced in their downtime, perfecting their swings, working on their pitches. Some showed genuine talent. A former college student named Masaru Tanaka, no relation to Orochi, developed a wicked curveball that baffled even the guards. They started calling him the Professor. The camp newspaper, a mimeographed sheet produced by prisoners and staff, began running box scores. Photos were taken. One famous image shows a prisoner mid-swing, his face locked in concentration, while a guard crouches behind him, glove ready. If you didn't know better, you'd think they were friends. And maybe, in a way, they were becoming exactly that. Friendship is a strange word to use in a POW camp. It suggests equality, choice, freedom, none of which truly existed behind the wire. And yet, something resembling friendship began to take root in the spaces between the rules. Eddie Larson became a fixture at the games. He wasn't particularly good at baseball, his throws were wild, his batting average dismal, but he was enthusiastic. He learned a few words of Japanese: konnichiwa, arigato, gambat, good luck. The prisoners, in turn, picked up English phrases. Good game. Nice catch. Better luck next time. The language barrier remained, but the meaning slipped through. Off the field, small gestures accumulated. A guard might share a cigarette with a prisoner during a break. A prisoner might help a guard repair a piece of equipment. One afternoon, a guard's wedding photo fell out of his pocket. A prisoner picked it up, handed it back, and said, in careful English, "Beautiful wife." The guard blinked, nodded, and said, "Thanks." It was the most ordinary exchange imaginable. It was also revolutionary. Not everyone participated. Some guards remained distant, professional, unwilling to see the prisoners as anything but the enemy. And among the prisoners, the hardliners refused to engage. They viewed the baseball games as a betrayal, a capitulation to propaganda. There were tensions, arguments, even fistfights in the barracks. The camp administration had to intervene more than once. But for those who did participate, the transformation was undeniable. Hiroshi Tanaka, the young infantryman who'd arrived expecting torture, found himself laughing during games. Genuinely laughing. He hadn't done that in years. He wrote letters home, censored, of course, but in them, he tried to describe what was happening. "I don't know how to explain it," he wrote to his sister. "They are still the enemy. But they are also just men. Like us." Masaru Tanaka, the pitcher with the curveball, struck up a conversation with one of the guards, a former minor league player from Ohio named Jack Riley. Jack gave him pointers. Masaru adjusted his grip, his stance, his release. His pitches got sharper. Jack started bringing a notebook, sketching diagrams, explaining strategies. They couldn't have a full conversation, but they didn't need to. Baseball was the language they shared. Years later, after the war, some of these men would reunite. Letters were exchanged. A few even met in person. Hiroshi Tanaka visited California in 1965 and tracked down Eddie Larson. They shook hands. They talked about the games, the camp, the strangeness of it all. Eddie still had a photo of Hiroshi at bat, mid-swing. He gave it to him. Hiroshi kept it for the rest of his life. The war ended. The camps emptied. The prisoners returned home to a Japan that had been shattered and rebuilt, a nation grappling with defeat and transformation. For many, the homecoming was not joyous. To have been captured, to have survived, carried a stain. Families turned away. Communities whispered. Some former prisoners lied about their service, inventing deaths that never happened, graves that didn't exist. But the memories of the baseball games stayed. Hiroshi Tanaka never spoke publicly about his time in the camp, but his children found his letters after he died. In them, they discovered a version of their father they hadn't known, younger, more vulnerable, caught between two worlds. "I learned something in that place," he wrote in one letter. "That even in war, we do not have to become monsters." Masaru Tanaka became a teacher. He never played baseball professionally, but he coached youth teams for 30 years. He taught his students about sportsmanship, respect, and the strange truth that a game invented on the other side of the world had once saved his life, not from death, but from despair. In America, the camps were largely forgotten. The war moved on. The nation moved on. But in the archives, in the fading photographs and the brittle pages of camp newspapers, the evidence remains. Men who should have hated each other played a game together. They laughed. They competed. They saw each other as human. It wasn't enough to end the war. It wasn't enough to erase the atrocities, the suffering, the loss. But it was something. A small rebellion against the machinery of hatred. A reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, there are moments when people choose differently. A glove. A ball. A game. And somewhere in that simplicity, a flicker of hope.